strange as it seems today, Washington didn't always value its built environment. Although local citizens were active in preservation in Georgetown as early as the 1920s, it wasn't until the construction of the Whitehurst Freeway in 1947 that local advocates were galvanized to help save their community. This organized activism resulted in the passage of the Old Georgetown Act in 1950. After World War II and the expansion of local suburbs, many of the city's older buildings were suffering from decades of neglect or simply demolished to make parking lots. In Southwest Washington, urban renewal destroyed thousands of buildings, hundreds of them understood to be historically significant. Planners contemplated freeways through the hearts of the city's oldest neighborhoods. Many thought Victorian buildings ugly, and often age was considered synonymous with decay and obsolescence in a city with a dwindling population and a declining downtown. These problems were not unique to Washington, as around the country people began to advocate for historic buildings. The architecture community here was especially vocal, helping to save Wheat Row, a group of 4 1793 row houses in Southwest, and making the case for threatened government landmarks like the Pension Building, Patent Office, and the old Executive Office Building. Journalists were key allies. In 1961, culture reporter Gene White cautioned Washington Post readers that, quote, under the pressure of the present, a city and its citizens must be on constant guard to see that their architectural heritage is not lost. When picketers protested the demolition of New York's Pennsylvania Station, Post architecture critic Wolf von Eckhart warned that Union Station was under similar threat.
Everybody thinks of the 60s as a decade of activism, and it was. But the war in Vietnam was only one of our big government programs. I mean, the others were interstate highway system, which in planning was going to make DC really split up city. I mean, downtown was basically going to surrounded by a fierce moat of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-lane highways. And they were going to plow through neighborhoods. And at the same time, the historic preservation was another part of the activism of the 60s.
Compelling voices also came from neighborhood groups like the Capitol Hill Restoration Society and the DuPont Circle Conservancy. By highlighting collections of vernacular buildings, these groups helped establish the significance of residential Washington. By 1964, the National Capital Planning Commission and the Fine Arts Commission created a joint committee on historic landmarks to lead the city's preservation efforts. Chaired by acclaimed architect Francis D. Lethbridge, the Joint Committee issued the city's first list of landmarks worthy of protection. But mere listing could not prevent demolition of even the most significant landmarks. In 1971, the old post office, a magnificent Richardsonian Romanesque building, was slated for demolition, all except for its tower, to allow for the completion of the Federal Triangle. Spurred by the fight to save this Washington landmark, the Post's Wolf von Eckhart urged Allison Owings, a young news writer and TV producer, to form an advocacy group, and Don't Tear It Down was born.
We picked 3 buildings initially to try to save: the old post office building, the Willard Hotel, which was threatened with demolition, and the Franklin School, which was also threatened with demolition, all I'm glad to say is still standing today. We had teams of people working on each one.
For the Young Advocacy Group, litigation was a key tool among limited options. Prudent use of temporary restraining orders bought time for potential landmarks. And Don't Tear It Down established precedents with several nationally important legal battles.
Well, after fighting individual battles for buildings, those 3 buildings, we realized that one building at a time was going to be a really hard row to hoe, and that we needed something bigger and broader.
A galling loss came in March 1973 when the 1891 McGill building was torn down with a permit issued over the counter while the Joint Committee deliberated on an emergency designation. Just weeks afterwards, the City Council took up a bill to delay issuance of permits to demolish a landmark for up to 8 months. But ultimately, the impact was limited, as most of the few delays granted were followed by demolition.
The original DC preservation law, such as it was, didn't provide permanent protection for historic buildings. What it provided was a cooling off period during which the developer was supposed to talk to the preservation people in the city and so forth. But after a certain period of time, could go ahead and do what they wanted anyway.
By the spring of 1978, Don't Tear It Down Vice President David Bonderman drafted a comprehensive bill for stronger protections and circulated it through community groups around the city. The bill soon caught the attention of D.C. lawmakers.
There was a big debate in the legal community in those days as to whether it was constitutional to regulate property ownership because of aesthetic values as opposed to for commercial purposes. And the Supreme Court decision in Grand Central laid that to rest and changed the entire face of both environmental and preservation.
Just days after the Supreme Court ruled that the New York City's historic preservation laws did not constitute an unconstitutional taking of Penn Central's private property, D.C.'s local bills were introduced. After months of discussion and negotiations among community groups, preservationists, the AIA, and the Board of Trade, the Historic Landmark and Historic District Protection Act passed the council in November 1978. Mayor Walter E. Washington signed it the following month, and it went into effect on March 3, 1979. To many, the new law represented the spirit of home rule and was an assertion that the district would take control of its destiny. The new law immediately proved a powerful tool. On the day it went into effect, more than 50 National Registered listed parks, monuments, churches, and buildings obtained protection, including the homes of civil rights leaders Charlotte Grimke, Carter G. Woodson, and Mary Ann Shadd Cary.
The impact was huge, major, big time. I mean, it was basically changed so much about things. It came with a great deal of power, and that power has been used for mostly for good, some not so good, some bad, but significant change in the way business was done, in the way architects thought about their field. It had a lasting and basically beneficial impact on architecture itself. Part of the extent, the power of the new law in setting up a historic preservation review board was, number one, the creation of historic districts, which grew over time, so the geographic extent of the power is quite large.
Over the years, landmarks have included properties associated with the history of Washington's African American community, landscapes, warehouses, theaters, apartment buildings. The 21st century brought robust growth and a reversal of decades of population decline. Proposals to increase density downtown and in many of the city's neighborhoods placed new pressures on the Preservation Act, even as it became more economically advantageous to restore or adapt buildings for new uses. At the same time, rising real estate prices increased attention to issues of gentrification and displacement.
We've had $3 billion worth of public and private investment in the neighborhood, much of it focused on development of properties that had historic components in them. And I have to say that a lot of that probably would not have happened if we had not created those historic districts. If there had not been a Preservation Act in Washington, D.C., I think the entire city would look very different. The development boom that occurred in the previous decade probably would have decimated many of our inner neighborhoods and would have left very little of the historic fabric that had survived. Obviously, over the course of a couple of centuries, we've gone through a number of major development booms and busts, and we probably would have ended up with a lot more, glass boxes without any historic fabric, without the design review that historic preservation affords in historic districts. We would not have had the quality of architecture that we have in many of our neighborhoods and in many parts of our city. One of the things that I often am told by visitors to Washington, D.C. is that they're just amazed about the fact that we managed to incorporate as much historic fabric into our new development, because that's not something that they're used to seeing in the cities that they're from.
More recently, D.C.'s preservation program is working to further diversify the inventories of protected historic properties. These efforts include documentation of local civil rights efforts, designation of outstanding examples of modernist architecture, and enhanced attention to underrepresented groups such as women, Asian Americans, and the LGBTQ community.
The city of Washington is what it is, and we have a lot to be thankful for. It's a beautiful city, a lot of trees, the human scale, the livability. And I think a lot of that's due to the Historic Preservation Act and to the HIDE Act, so that we can maintain the quality of life in the city and the character of a national capital that people come to and just marvel at the beauty of.
Historic preservation and economic development go hand in hand in Washington, D.C. The reality is that the quality of the developments is so much better as a result of the inclusion of historic buildings.
Over the 40 years since the passage of the Historic Landmark and Historic District Protection Act, the preservation of our heritage has become an accepted principle that has helped the district thrive and retain its unique character in the midst of a dramatic economic renewal. Tens of thousands of historic buildings have been protected and adapted to meet modern needs, and entire neighborhoods have been reinvigorated to ensure that our heritage remains a vital and valued part of our city's future.